I'm so happy to be up here with this great group of panelists who are all really working on the front lines, whether as doctors, caregivers, writers, or all three, to help the rest of us think more deeply about how we approach death in this country. And I think many of you in this room are probably here because you're grappling in some way with the issue of death and are at least beginning to think about how you might negotiate the end of your own lives when the time comes and nobody's rushing you. As well as how we can help the people that we love negotiate theirs. So I'm going to start by introducing everyone on the panel, and I just want to say to my panelists that I consider this a conversation, so please feel free to interrupt me and ask each other questions and follow up. And we're also going to try and have a brief question and answer period at the end of our talk, so we'll get moving quickly. So I'm going to start with Katy Butler. I first became aware of Katy's work when she wrote an extraordinary article for the New York Times Magazine about her father's prolonged and difficult death after a catastrophic stroke. And it resonated with me very deeply because I had experienced similar issues when my mother was in the last days of her struggle with Parkinson's. So I was thrilled when she went on to write a really beautiful and extensively researched book that was based on that article called Knocking on Heaven's Door, The Path to a Better Way of Life.
Yeah.
Why do I have life?
I don't know.
My apologies. I got some bad information here. Okay, so I'm so sorry. That makes a lot more sense too. Okay, I'll say it again. Knocking on Heaven's Door, The Path to a Better Way of Death. The book has received all sorts of accolades, including being named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and Katy has written for many, many publications and is currently at work on another book about death, which maybe she will give us a hint as to what that's about. So Louise Aronson is a doctor and an author, as well as a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She has a National Gold Professorship in Humanism and Medicine and directs medical humanities at UCSF. She is also the chief of geriatrics education and sees patients in the Care at Home program. Her writing has appeared in publications including Narrative Magazine, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the New York Times. And Louise is also the author of a beautiful book of short stories called A History of the Present Illness. Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay. And it was a PEN America Debut Fiction Award finalist, so that's really terrific. Okay, and Jessica Nutik Zitter is another one of these doctor-writer combos who are sort of incredibly impressive. She practices both critical and palliative care at Highland Hospital in Oakland, which really puts her in a remarkable position to see our end-of-life protocols up close and personal. In 2005, she co-founded Vital Decisions, which is a telephone counseling service that helps patients and their families participate actively in making decisions about their medical care at the end of life. She's written extensively about her work in the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and various medical journals, and I believe she's under contract to write a book, which maybe she can also briefly describe for us in a minute. So our last panelist, Monica Wesolowska, is the author of the beautiful and very moving memoir Holding Silvan, A Brief Life, about her son Silvan, which was named a Best Book of 2013 by both the Boston Globe and Library Journal, and has been published internationally. Her stories and essays have appeared in many other venues, including the New York Times, the Carolina Quarterly, and Best New American Voices. Monica is also a regular speaker at hospitals about neonatal loss, and she conducts writing workshops about loss, as well as teaching at UC Berkeley Extension and around the Bay Area for over a decade. So, my terrific panelists. Let's hear a hand for them. They're really an amazing group. Okay, so I want to start off by asking each panelist to briefly tell us why you, as writers, chose death as your subject, or maybe why it chose you. And I can't help but think that there are a lot more cheerful things to write about. So I want to hear from you a little something about what led you to make this your topic. And we can start this way this time, if that's great.
Okay. Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to just stand if you don't mind, because I can see a lot of you can't see in the back, so let's all do it. I think I wrote about it out of both bewilderment and outrage. My father had a major stroke, which catapulted him into the end of his life. He'd been very healthy up until the age of 79. And then a couple of years later, he was given a pacemaker, which, with no discussion. And then he descended very slowly over years into dementia and real misery and near blindness. And I just could not understand why $22,000 worth of surgery would be done at the drop of a hat with no discussion, where a doctor, Medicare would simply not have paid a doctor at that point to have any meaningful discussion about these incredibly complex and subtle end-of-life issues. So it was a combination of the way I was ambushed by my love for my parents when they really descended, and my outrage and curiosity, I think, as a journalist about how did we get here as a culture where we are so incapable of talking about death or creating a medical system that actually meaningfully supports people in the ways they really need at the end of their lives. So that's how I got there. I was surprised. I thought this whole thing of taking care of my parents was a tremendous detour from my life as a journalist and a writer, and it actually turned out to be my path in a very deep way. So that's
Great. Thank you.
Well, I actually didn't set out to write about death so much as I set out to write about the... Sorry, it sounds loud here. I didn't actually set out to write about death so much as I set out to write about people and lives. I wanted to write stories that each individually showed a life of a different kind. The stories are all set in San Francisco, and all the characters are either a doctor or a patient. And I felt, with all the vitriol about healthcare, including about death, that we were losing sight of the most important thing about healthcare and life and death, which is the people and the intimate moments. And I think partly I came to death because I'm a geriatrician, so most of my patients are in their 80s, 90s, and 100s. And partly I came to it because I think as a novice writer, it's a good dramatic moment at which everything becomes realized in a story. Mm-hmm. And so I think it really ended up defining the book in a way that surprised me, but maybe it shouldn't have, because it's one of the brackets that really defines life. So I thought it was interesting that you said life instead of death, because in some ways I think they're interchangeable there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi. I think I've been writing for about a decade and a half, really, probably 2 decades since I started practicing as an ICU physician. And I think I started out writing because I was so uncomfortable with what I was doing a lot of the time, and I needed a way to process it. And I thought I was trained to do something, and so I thought I darn well better do it. And yet I was having more and more discomfort with some of the things I was being asked and expected to do. And so when I had an epiphany, I think it was probably 2003, when I was working, luckily, at University Hospital in Newark, New Jersey. And I just happened to be in this place where, unbeknownst to me, they had won a very rare grant to start enhancing communication in the intensive care unit. And I started out being very frustrated by these nurses who would come in and criticize many of the things that I was doing. And one day I was putting a Quinton catheter for dialysis into the neck of a woman who had stage 4 metastatic cancer and who would actually be dead the next day. And I was all set and ready to go, and I had the whole room prepped with sterile gowns and drapes, and I looked up, and Pat Murphy, the nurse at the head of this family support team, was standing in the doorway. And she said, she put up her hand to her ear as though it was a pretend phone, and she said, 911, get me the police. They are torturing a patient in the ICU at University Hospital. And there it was. So at that point, I really started writing in earnest, and it was really for myself. I started trying to get it published, and it wasn't really getting in anywhere. And then I was just lucky enough to start having it get published. And it's been a tough road for me because I've found that it's generated a lot of controversy in my world. So that's where I come from.
Wow, this is great. Such a crowd, and these great people to talk right after. So I wrote my book. I chose the topic of death, as Zoe put it. I wrote it because it was a book I wanted to read. I just couldn't find that book out there. For me, the book I couldn't find was a book about choosing to let someone go, specifically one's own child. I just felt that I didn't see a lot of models of mother love that showed a mother saying, let's not do all we can to keep this baby alive. So my son was severely brain damaged during labor. And so and he couldn't feed, couldn't interact, couldn't move, and so we removed him from life support. But the book ended up, I couldn't have written the book if it was just a story about death. The book was really a time for me to, revisit our choice and see if it really felt that it was the loving choice that I thought it was at the time, and a chance to relive the incredible joy of having 38 days with my son.
Thank you, Monica. So I think now that you've told us something about why you write what you write, I'm curious how you feel that writing has changed you. And I know that people often say to me when they find out about my book, it must have been very cathartic to write that book. And I've never been completely convinced that that really was the experience I had, catharsis. But I'm going to toss that question to you and ask you, how has writing about the things you write about changed you? And did you find solace in doing it? Did you find community? Did you feel that you had to get every advance directive ever known to mankind written and signed and on your bedside table? I'm just curious how the experience has changed you. If that's working for you. I don't want to be too formulaic.
I think that's just such a wonderful question. I did cry a lot when I was writing my book, because I was really writing about the whole 8 years between my father's stroke and the deaths of both my parents, because my father had this terrifically prolonged bad death, really. And my mother had a very quick, valiant death because she chose very consciously not to do surgery at the age of 84 and died 5 months later. I think it was very healing for me. I don't know, cathartic goes far enough, but I do so strongly believe that all of us need to write the narratives of our lives, whether we're professional writers or not. And for me, it was an opportunity to bring to light the more positive parts of our family story, because we were, in fact, a very high-powered and contentious family, and there was lots and lots of wounds from the past, but I was really able to revisit my love for my parents and my gratitude to them for all the things that they had done for me. And I think it's almost like a new life stage a lot of us baby boomers are in, which is that because our parents are declining so slowly over such a long time, I really had to kind of soldier up and be the adult and help and move out of that life stage. It's embarrassing to say that at the age of 50 you would need to move out of this life stage, but at 50 I was still kind of in a gimme state, gimme attitude toward my parents. Where's the money? Where's the the apologies for everything you did wrong and all, yeah. It's pathetic, but it's the truth. And when my father had that stroke, there was this shift. So I was able to bring to the light or highlight the aspects of my life experience with my parents where I was very grateful, and also where I had done not such a bad job. I mean, when I did have to sort of step up, I'm actually extremely proud of the way that I did that, and being able to write it down and say, hey, you did okay,
And I think that becoming your parents' caretaker and having that really major shift in roles is such a big moment and process. And I'm wondering if Louise could talk about that, because you deal with a lot of caregivers, and maybe you could mention, some of what that transition is about.
Sure. I think, the transition from being the adult child to being the caretaker, I'm not sure it's all or nothing, and it's as individual as we are individuals. I think so often in dealing with these issues, we have the sense that there's a right way. And I guess if there was one message I wanted people to get, is there isn't a right way. There may be a way that works best for you, and sorting that out. And actually, Katy's book is a lovely journey through one family sorting that out, and in that way is a nice model of what you need to do. It's as honest as she was right now, which is its power in part, in addition to all the great stories in journalism. Should I answer your other question as well about how it changed me? So
thank you.
I started writing basically in response to my decade of training and 100-hour weeks, in which I felt that all the sort of creative, imaginative parts of me had been crushed to barely perceptible fashion. So I signed up for a class at UC Extension and thought this was my extracurricular activity, and I really had no intention of writing about medicine. And yet, perhaps the greatest thing about being a doctor is the intimate way in which you touch other people's lives and the stories that you get to be a small part of or to witness. And so with all those stories accumulating, my imagination couldn't, and in fact did not need to, try and compete with the wonderful things that I was learning from patients and caregivers every day. And it was interesting because I set out to write fiction, and this is fiction, but it's also very true and based on my experience. And I think it changed me in the sense that I would have said I was a doctor who was inclined towards people. In medical school, we make jokes about I love science, I love people. And I was sort of like, I love people, and okay, I'll do the science. So, and that went okay. But what writing taught me, and the book has stories from a variety of different perspectives, was that I was thinking I understood other people's perspectives better than I did, and only by inhabiting them through fiction did I get a little better at that and also appreciate the degree of distance there is always.
Thank you.
Writing for me started out very cathartic because I was just struggling so much. It's been supportive in a lot of ways. First of all, it's helped me process a lot of the stuff that I am constantly thinking about. A lot of my writing poses questions. I don't think that there's easy answers. We sometimes think good death, bad death. It's pretty obvious. What do you do? It's not obvious. It's certainly not obvious in the intensive care unit. What's obvious is that you need to talk and you need to communicate and you need to have big, informational experiences with families and try to, but it's not always clear how to access a good death because there's a lot of murkiness, particularly in the ICU. So I think and it's not just, by the way, medical prognostic murkiness, it's ethical murkiness. It's what should we be doing here? This person's kidneys are starting to fail. There's a chance that this infectious problem might start to get a little bit better, but at the same time, they're going into multi-system organ failure. So do we give them dialysis for a couple more days to try to keep them going to see? These are complicated medical questions and they're complicated ethical questions. And so for me, writing has been a big processing forum. It's somehow been supportive. I've been able to find incredible people to support me. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're in the medical community, unfortunately, and that's been very hard for me, and I hope that that's going to change with time. My family's been incredibly supportive. Getting this stuff down on paper is really important to me, and I feel like I'm bearing witness to some really important things that need to be talked about. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I love this question because I think a lot about catharsis as a teacher of writing, because it wasn't really why I set out to write this book. I may have written my diary for cathartic reasons, but the book was very different for me. But one of the things that struck me at the time that I was going through my experience with my son Silvan is that my brain was already working with narrative. I would find myself faced with a really huge decision, and I would think, will I be able to tell this story in the future? Will I be okay with myself if I tell people this is what happened? And one of the things that came out as he had been in the hospital for about a month and I knew he was going to die, I started thinking, will I be okay if I have to tell people he died in a hospital? And I thought, well, maybe not. I don't really want to tell that story. I want to say he died in my arms at home. And then I thought, oh, well, then take him home. And you know, as a hospice nurse who helped us with that transition said, you can't guarantee anything in death, but he did die at home in my arms very peacefully. And so I just really, I'm a huge believer in the power of stories, not just listening to other people's stories, but thinking about the story of your own life. And I think that the only way, if this is a room full of people who are concerned about what a good death is, the only way to have a chance at a good death for oneself or for one's loved ones is to talk about what that means, what that will feel like, what that story should be. And again, we can't guarantee that story, but that is a first step, is creating the stories. And that was a reason for me to write this book. I thought I need to have a book out there, not just for other parents who are faced with a decision for a baby, because certainly there are more of us out there than you would think, and I hear from them, and that's very, very moving to me. But almost more moving to me is when I hear from people in all walks of life who say my book mattered because it is simply about what is a good life and a good death, even if that death is only 38 days long.
Absolutely.
I just want to piggyback off something you said, which is this creation of stories, because I think we've developed some kind of amnesia about death and a very euphemistic language. So, like Jessica said, multi-system organ failure. That really means dying, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
That's awesome. So we're working with trying to recreate a common language for these experiences. And I notice even up here that this sort of tendency toward euphemism and towards wanting to dodge what we actually want to say or think is even present here, you know?
I'm just going to piggyback on that because I've been on a crusade lately with my colleagues who are geriatricians and palliative care physicians and often don't use the word death. And I just keep saying, if you guys can't do it, how on earth do you expect anyone else to do it?
That was great. Thank you. Great comments. So I want to just turn to the politics of death for a moment and ask you if there was one thing that you would change about how we approach death in this country as doctors and caregivers, but also as the relatives of those who die. What would it be? And obviously there are many to choose from, so I'm asking you to really pick one that you feel really works against helping people die a peaceful dignified and pain-free death. And I'm going to try and move it along a little quicker this time just because we have one more topic to get in, and we're cruising towards our question period.
Well, for me, it's all about the money, because I know you others can talk about the other stuff, but it's like we don't fund palliative care. We don't fund hospice. We limit the eligibility of hospice to ridiculous extents. You have to be within 6 months of dying. You have to have a clear diagnosis that's going to kill you. It eliminates all kinds of people who could use hospice. We don't fund palliative care. We don't fund people like these people so that they could actually take time. So if we reimbursed, Medicare reimbursed not so much for technology and a lot more for time spent, relationship, trust, the human side of medicine, I think the reason this hasn't shifted in 30 years is because of the money.
I actually think that's the single most important answer, so I would just say, I agree, you get what you pay
What she
for,
said.
and we're paying for the wrong things.
Thank you.
And I agree with what they said, but I would add information transfer. We doctors are not giving you the information you need. We are not talking about death, and we're not telling you what's going on.
Yeah, and along the same lines, it's all about language for me, and these doctors who were not able to say straight what we were talking about. And I just, my crusade is that I think that birth, everyone knows that's an incredible experience. If you were invited to a birth, many people would say yes. Many people, when they're invited to a death, or most people are not invited, but if they know that there is a death imminent, they don't want to go. You think about those two words, birth, death, they're beautiful words that mark incredible transitions that happen once. And if you're not there to witness it, you don't witness it.
Thank you. Yes, I think death can be, sadly, a very lonely experience. Oftentimes people are stuck in hospitals. So now I'm going to get even just a tad more political. Based on my experience with my mother, I'm really a big supporter of legal physician-assisted suicide. I figure a few of you probably are. And I believe strongly that people should have the legal right to choose to die on their own terms. And I was very pleased this week when the California State Senate passed the End of Life Option Act this past week, which is based on the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. And it will now go to the Assembly, so we're not there yet. But it's a big step forward, and I think the American Medical Association has withdrawn their objections to it. And we're moving in a good direction. Oregon and Washington have had this law in the books for a long time. Recently, Montana, and just very recently, Vermont has established similar acts. So I just want to ask the panelists, and all of you don't have to speak, but if you have strong feelings about it, is it a good thing? Do you have concerns? What's your perspective on that particular law?
12 million people watched Brittany Menard's end-of-life plea around this issue, but I think I'm very ambivalent about it. I mean, it's like abortion for me. It's like I'm totally in favor of it being an option and a right, but if you think it is going to solve the end-of-life problems or the suffering of this final rite of passage, that is a pipe dream. It's a pipe dream to think that technology is going to be able to postpone death forever, and I think it's also a pipe dream to think that for most people that, we're going to live at this real high quality of life, and then we're going to pick the perfect moment, and then kabam, it'll be all over, and we won't even have to know about it. I think this issue opens a very important door, but the issues are more complex for most people than will ever be satisfied by that bill.
But Katy, let me ask you, it does mean that people will not be ending up in jail if they're following these protocols, and I think that in and of itself has got to be a hugely positive thing, or worrying about ending up in jail.
Sure, but again, I mean, in Oregon, a few hundred people have accessed this in like 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
So, and how many people have suffered unnecessarily as they died in Oregon for completely other reasons, like ending up in an ICU because nobody told them the truth, you know? It's, our trajectories down now tend to be, very few people have the waterfall trajectory where you get to be high quality of life and then fall off the cliff. Because of medical advances, so many things create some kind of long stair-step type of decline. And we need to be able to help those people, and these bills are not going to solve that for most of those people.
Thank you. So maybe just one or two more comments, and then I think we are going to open up to questions. There are a lot of people here.
I think the key point is that most people haven't availed themselves of the option because it doesn't actually solve the problems that most people confront at end of life. And that rewarding conversations, imagine if you considered what you valued most and you discussed it with the people who care about you most and enabled them to make a decision on your behalf when you no longer can. Too often, when the suffering begins, people no longer have the ability to make the decisions they want to make, and it's a huge responsibility on others. And so people err on the side of keeping someone alive. There is also the Uncle Ralph phenomenon, where the person who, we say in Indiana, and then we had a Grand Round speaker from Indiana who apparently they say Uncle Ralph from California. Uncle Ralph has not been very helpful during the long illness. And then when death is near, Uncle Ralph wants everything done. Poor Uncle Ralph, but anyway. I think we need to really think about what matters, make sure there's someone who knows, make sure that person has the legal ability to decide, and also make clear to that person that they are deciding on your behalf, they are not deciding for you, because otherwise it weighs so heavily that they give in to doing and doing. And also we need to train health professionals much better.
Those are great points.
To help with life, rather.
So in a situation like mine with a baby, physician-assisted suicide, this law won't do anything. But my book, I mean, I'm really glad to see that this legislation is out there and this conversation is happening, because in my book I'm asking this question, which is to remove my son from life support and watch him slowly fade was, for him, I believe, a painless event. It was very traumatic for me, but I'm totally willing to bear that trauma for my son. But is it really the most compassionate? And I don't know. I can't answer that question yet. I do think that it's incredibly dangerous to think it would be easier simply to give my son some kind of something that would let him just slip away now. And I don't know. It gave us time to really be with him. But it's a question. Perhaps it's not the most compassionate, so that even in cases like that, where someone couldn't decide for himself because he simply didn't have any experience of life or thinking along those lines, would it be more compassionate to let him go in another way? And I really think that we need to think very honestly about that, and without a lot of hysteria, because yeah, it's not a cut and dry issue, and every case is different, and that's what we're talking about, is that we need to be able to talk about every single case and say what is okay in this situation.
Yeah, Jessica, why don't you make a final comment? I'm going to open
Okay,
it,
I'll make a
'cause
very quick one.
I sort of wanted to have the doctor weigh in. That was a great
Yeah.
point, Monica.
I actually was holding back because I'm going to be honest with you. I know there's a political groundswell towards supporting this, and I'm very ambivalent about it, honestly, personally. As a palliative care physician, we have a very, very high success rate at making people physically comfortable and treating symptoms. We're very good at it. And so it's very, I've seen many patients for whom I think it would be appropriate to give a pill because there's tremendous existential angst, there's whatever the reason. But I think it's really a case-by-case situation, and I, as a doctor, don't really feel comfortable having people come to me and then having to sit down and do a whole assessment about really, is this an appropriate case? Is this not an appropriate case? And so I'm really ambivalent about it. And I'm not saying I disagree with it. I just think we need to be really thinking about it carefully and talking very carefully about it.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Those were great comments and a really good discussions. And we have about, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes left. So let's get some questions in quickly. And if you could stand up and ask your question and speak as loudly as you can. Okay, go ahead.
So my question is, do we know of any other countries that are doing it better, right? What can we learn from them? Can you speak about that at all?
Does someone want to take that question? Oh, sure. Is there another country that we can look at who's doing death and dying better than we are in this country?
What's really concerning about that question is that there was actually just a study that was done that's showing that countries, even in the developing world, are starting to emulate the United States and the Western world. So it's very worrisome, actually. But I will say one quick anecdote that's very interesting is I work with a lot of residents from Pakistan, from other countries, and I remember a conversation with one of my residents where we were going back and forth, and she just looked at me and she laughed. She said, "I'm sorry, but you Americans just crack me up. You're so, it wouldn't even be a question. We wouldn't be having this discussion about whether or not to offer this particular thing in our country."
I think England does a little better. They have something called the Liverpool Pathway for the Dying, where they actually have a protocol for hospital on how to have a humane hospital death rather than a fight death.
And then in Switzerland also, there are these places you can go. Yeah, in the Netherlands too. Okay. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The panel to address kind of the flip side of the issue. It's not just the medical care system that's the issue. There are so many people that don't want to hear about death and dying, don't want to talk about it. The sick person will say, "Oh, my family will know what to do with my time."
So
How do you approach that issue?
How do you get the conversation started about death when there's so much reluctance to talk about it?
In the 1450s, the best-selling book was called Ars Moriendi, which meant the art of dying. And so it was actually laid out, the trials of the deathbed were laid out and expected. And it was part of your responsibility as a mature person to have really imagined your own death. And I think, it's starting to happen in our culture now, but I think there's a book called The Conversation by Angelo Volandes, and he talks about, the question isn't, do I want to be plugged into a tube or not? The question is, what makes my life worth living? And if those qualities could not be present, what kind of medicine would I want to decline? So I do think there's the whole underside. The medical culture's in trouble, but there's also, we are in trouble and we collude with that.
I just have to comment on that because that's a big part of what I deal with in the intensive care unit all the time. And it's a real, we think, oh, it's the doctors and it's the medical system and but actually I'm here to tell you that it's not always. And there's a lot of families who, they either, whether it's believing in miracles or not wanting to talk about it or being in denial or family dysfunction that causes a lot of strife. And it happens all the time, and it's a real concern of mine because I think patients end up suffering for it.
Just one historical thing. So adolescence didn't exist until after the Industrial Revolution. And the word teenager did not exist until the 19-teens or early 20s. Right? So we deal with aging even less than we deal with dying. But that is starting to change. If you look around, you'll see that there is conversation. We need terms for these, and we need to use them. So each and every one of us in this room can be part of this change by talking about these things and also by not making them exclusively negative, right? Like being a teenager is such a great thing, we'd all go back and do that again. Really. Yes, there are problems with your 50s, for example, but there are also wonderful things, and we need to broaden that conversation and have it frequently.
Thank you. That's a great comment. Yeah.
I wonder if what people think about when they're writing out their living will around what makes life worth living changes when their abilities change and when they're in a different situation.
They do.
Definitely. So the question was, does what a person consider a value or a life worth living change? And it does. So the key thing is, are you still in a position to say those things and to have that conversation? This should not be something you have the conversation once at age 35 or 55 or 75 or 85 or even 95. It's an ongoing conversation. What you need to be preparing for is the moment where you can no longer participate in that conversation. And if not, you should keep bringing it up.
Great. So I think we have time for just one more question. She had her hand up first. Sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to know if you think the POLS form is helpful, and isn't I aware of the do not resuscitate bracelet, and what do you think of that?
So Jessica, why don't you explain to us what the pulse
That's
form is?
to me, the pulse form is one of the most important forms that people need to know about, and people don't know about it. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't even accompany you to the hospital, but if you're very clear about what your goals are, if you are frail, elderly, have stage 4 cancer, have any number of conditions that will make it unlikely that you will benefit from life prolongation or excessive use of technology, you should consider filling out a POLST form. A POLST form is a physician-signed order that you take with you to your home. It's transportable across state lines. You can actually get it on a medic alert bracelet. That's one thing that the paramedics will honor. And if it says comfort measures only, then the paramedics are not going to feel their obligation to resuscitate you, which they otherwise do feel. Even if there's family members saying, no, 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 they will still resuscitate you if they're called to a scene of a call. But just make sure that if you need to understand what a POLST form, it's really a very important protection.
So POLST, but if you are a healthy person, you don't want it. So these are. Well, seriously, I mean, it's true. It's true. So people begin to think that everybody should have one. What it is it's a form that offers you options for resuscitation or not, for tube feeding or not, but most importantly for 3 levels of care. One is do everything. One is comfort measures only. And the middle one is limited treatment. So things that will clearly return you to a good state, okay, and if you're basically already dead, then
Would you say it's really to prevent somebody who is pretty much actively dying from having lots of heroic final measures, taking place?
Actively dying might be too far the other direction.
Okay.
I think if you are gravely ill, have
gravely
have
ill.
a life-threatening condition, and or are very frail, have an array of conditions, then you should have a POLST form. If you're not in one of those categories.
To prevent some very invasive last-minute measures that are probably just going to make you miserable and you're
right, to
not
tailor
prolong
the
your life.
care to the life that you want and the death that you want. It's about tailoring.
So you should have an advanced directive.
Absolutely.
Everyone should have an advanced directive.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's a very good note to end this discussion on. Go get your advanced directives in place. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you guys. This great panelists.